So Harry is having quite the week. And I don't mean that in a good way. Time magazine put him on a list. His wife posted a photo from nearly a decade ago within hours. A Canadian veteran is suing over injuries sustained at the Invictus Games. And Harry reportedly wasn't invited to his own cousin's wedding while the rest of his family attended. Those four things happened in the same news cycle, and the sequence of how they unfolded tells you more about where Harry actually stands right now than any carefully placed magazine feature ever could. Let's start with Time magazine because the recognition itself is the starting point for everything else that followed. Time included Harry on its list of the 100 most influential people in sport. The immediate online reaction was sharp. One of the most liked comments, gathering close to 1,000 interactions, asked a single question: did he buy it? That comment became a talking point not because it's necessarily accurate or fair, but because it captured the mood of a significant section of the public who have been watching Harry's relationship with prestigious recognitions across recent years and who have concluded that the pattern of honours he receives requires examining rather than simply accepting. Harry is not a professional athlete. He doesn't coach a team. He doesn't train, compete, hold a formal management role in a sporting federation, or work in a broadcast or media industry that covers sport. He doesn't hold any role in the competitive sporting landscape that typically generates what would be understood as sporting influence in the context of a list that usually includes those categories of person. His connection to sport runs through Invictus, which he founded in 2014 and which has grown into a significant international event featuring adaptive sports competition for wounded veterans. And through his public advocacy for veteran centered initiatives, supporters argue that founding and sustaining a competition of that scale with the global profile that Invictus has built over a decade is a legitimate basis for sporting influence, regardless of personal athletic achievement. That argument has genuine force and should be acknowledged before proceeding. Founding an international sporting event that has persisted for over a decade and attracted participation from dozens of countries is not nothing. It requires organisational skill, sustained commitment, and the ability to attract funding and institutional support. The question critics raise isn't whether Harry deserves recognition for that work. It's whether the specific framing of influence in sport fits what he actually does, and whether the pattern of honours he's received across multiple domains suggests something other than merit-based selection. Critics point to the Pat Tillman Award controversy, where the name of the man who left a professional NFL career and died serving in military combat was attached to a recognition for someone whose relationship to active military service ended in very different circumstances. Each time Harry receives an honour that generates a comparable debate, the previous ones are recalled and the pattern across them becomes part of the same conversation, which is not the outcome that any individual recognition is designed to produce. The Time interview accompanying the listing didn't provide material that changed the debate. It covered familiar themes: the impact of sport on veterans' lives, the power of Invictus as a concept. There was nothing new or surprising in the content. The one detail that stood out to observers closely following the Sussex story was what was absent from the piece: Meghan. Her name appeared exactly nowhere in the interview. In a major American magazine feature about her husband, published in one of the most widely read publications in the United States, she was not mentioned once. Not in the context of shared work, not in passing, not anywhere. For a couple whose entire public brand has been built around their partnership, their shared projects, their joint foundation and production company, and media strategy. The complete absence of Meghan's name from a feature about Harry's most significant solo achievement is either an editorial choice or a strategic one. And neither explanation is particularly flattering to the narrative of unified purpose that the Sussex brand depends on. Within hours of the Time feature circulating, Meghan posted to Instagram. The post was titled "Springing into Summer," and it immediately generated its own separate wave of attention, which is the point where the sequence of the week becomes interesting as a story about timing and communication. The post included several photographs that became the subjects of separate and simultaneous debates. One showed Meghan lying face down in casual clothing with her face not visible, which commenters found unusual as a choice of image to share publicly. Another included her daughter, which attracted immediate attention in the context of the ongoing conversation about how the Sussex children appear in public content. The photograph that generated the most sustained and widespread discussion was a black and white romantic image of Harry and Meghan together. Online commenters quickly began reporting that the image dated from approximately 2017 rather than being recent. So Meghan was sharing a photograph from 8 or 9 years ago and presenting it in a post that arrived within hours of Harry receiving his first significant positive recognition in months, a recognition that did not mention her. Critics interpreted the timing as deliberate communication. Harry gets positive solo coverage. Meghan is absent from it. Meghan posts a romantic Harry and Meghan image alongside family content on the same day. Whether or not that reading is accurate, and we should be fair about this, it is the reading that circulated most widely, and it generated significantly more engagement than the time recognition itself. Supporters argued that people routinely share meaningful personal photographs, regardless of when they were taken, and that reading a coordinated PR response into an Instagram post assumes a level of calculation that may simply not be there. It's a fair counter-argument. What it cannot fully explain is why, from an apparent archive of tens of thousands of photographs, the specific image selected happened to be a romantic couple image from approximately 8 years ago, posted on the day that Harry appeared in Time magazine without Meghan's name appearing in the piece. The kitchen video that appeared in the same period added its own layer, Meghan cutting onions, with the technique becoming the focal point of social media analysis. One comment that circulated widely: "I've never in my life felt sorry for an onion." Whether the criticism is fair or disproportionate is a separate question. What it reflects is a pattern where Meghan's domestic cooking content is being received by a significant and vocal audience, not as lifestyle inspiration, but as performance. And where the gap between the aspirational register of the presentation and the apparent execution has become a consistent part of the critique repeated across multiple videos and multiple product launches. Now, let's talk about Scott Snow, because his story cuts through the institutional financial debate and puts a specific human face on the questions about what Invictus actually does for the veterans it's built around when the formal event ends and the cameras stop rolling. Scott Snow arrived at the 2023 Invictus Games as one of the most recognisable members of Team Canada, a decorated Navy diver with a documented service record. He was proud to represent his country and ready to compete. During his first wheelchair rugby match, his chair flipped backward and he crashed hard onto the court. The injuries that followed were severe and life-altering: a fractured cervical spine, a fractured lumbar spine, and head trauma requiring hospitalization. He underwent 2 surgeries. What he reportedly discovered in the aftermath was that he was not covered by insurance for injuries sustained at the event. According to the claims in his legal case, active service members on the team had coverage in place through their military status, while veterans, people who had completed their service like Scott, were in a different category and were not protected in the same way. He claims this distinction was never clearly communicated to him before he competed, that he arrived at an event designed for wounded veterans, with the reasonable expectation that the organisation had arranged for participants to be protected, and that this expectation was not met. Scott Snow is reportedly seeking $2.4 million in damages. The consequences he now lives with are specific and documented in his legal claim. He can no longer walk up the stairs in his own home. He is reportedly spending approximately $5,000 every month from his own pocket to remain in a facility equipped to support his needs. Let the specific and concrete cruelty of that sit for a moment, because it's easy to get lost in the institutional financial debate and lose sight of what that debate is actually about. He arrived at an event whose entire public and stated purpose is to honour wounded service members, to demonstrate what they can still achieve in competitive sport, and to communicate through that competition that the people who built the organisation behind the Games stand meaningfully behind veterans when it counts. He competed in exactly that spirit. He sustained injuries in competition that compounded the conditions he was already managing from his prior service. And when he needed the support that the event's language, its speeches, its promotional videos, its mission statements promised to veterans, he was reportedly told that coverage for people in his category had not been arranged, and that the costs were his to absorb. His case is one lawsuit, not a settled finding. The legal process will determine what the courts conclude, but the specific details of it are now part of the Invictus public record. And they sit directly alongside the financial questions about where the $63.2 million from Vancouver actually went. Rachel Maxwell's research put the per competitor cost at approximately $118,000 for 543 participants. The US Warrior Games, same mission, wounded service members competing in adaptive sports, runs on roughly $2 million annually. A comparable event in Germany ran for approximately $200,000 with roughly half the number of participants. Maxwell asked a specific question that has been asked repeatedly since: whether many of those veterans might have preferred that kind of money be directed toward prosthetics, home accessibility upgrades, or vehicles equipped for wheelchair use. The kind of concrete expenditure that changes daily life in documented and measurable ways. Maxwell also identified that approximately $30 million in Canadian taxpayer money moved through the Vancouver Whistler Games Corporation, which then paid a licensing fee to the British Invictus Games Foundation. When she attempted to determine the exact size of that licensing fee from the public budget documents, the figure had been redacted. She also reportedly observed that government officials appeared to be monitoring who was downloading those documents, a detail that, true or not, became part of the story once it was published. A redacted licensing fee and a document funded by public money. Veterans allegedly not covered by insurance at a competition built around their participation. A Navy diver with 2 fractured vertebrae spending $5,000 a month from his own resources because the protection he assumed was in place was not there. These are the specific details that the Invictus financial debate keeps generating. And they are why the petition to remove Harry from the Games is attracting signatures from people who describe themselves as supporters of the veteran mission rather than opponents of it. The argument isn't that Invictus does nothing. It's that the gap between its public presentation and its actual financial priorities has become too large to ignore, and that the people bearing the cost of that gap are the veterans the organisation claims to serve. Now, let's talk about the wedding because it completes the picture of a week that was already generating significant commentary before it was added. A report published in the New York Post in the days leading up to Trooping the Colour described Harry's expected UK visit in July for Invictus-related promotional activities. The report covered several elements: his hopes of bringing Meghan and the children to the UK, the ongoing dispute about armed security for his family during the visit, and the fact that no meeting with King Charles had been confirmed or publicly scheduled. The detail buried within the report that drew the sharpest reaction from royal watchers was the claim that Harry was not invited to Peter Phillips's wedding. Peter Phillips is Princess Anne's son, Harry's first cousin, the son of his aunt, and therefore a natural and close member of the family circle. It's a family relationship with no institutional dimension and no protocol complication. There is no official reason, no security difficulty, no working royal protocol consideration, and no constitutional factor that would explain the absence of a first cousin from a family celebration. Weddings within the extended royal family are personal occasions, not official engagements, whose guest lists are managed by palace communications teams for reputational purposes. Who receives an invitation to a family wedding reflects relationships, not roles. The wedding was attended by William and Catherine, King Charles and Queen Camilla, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. The full senior membership of the working royal family attended, plus extended family members who don't hold official roles but maintain active family relationships. Harry was not there. The significance of family weddings in this conversation is specific. They're not official engagements governed by protocol and invitation lists managed by communications teams for reputational reasons. They're private family occasions where presence reflects relationships rather than roles. When virtually every other family member attends a wedding, the absence of one person is communicating something that no statement can fully neutralise. The pushback to the New York Post report included a specific denial of the claim that Harry doesn't have William's phone number. A claim that had circulated in royal commentary based on sourcing that hadn't been publicly contested until this week, critics noted that the denial itself was interesting, that someone chose to respond to that specific and relatively minor seeming detail publicly, suggesting it had landed in a specific place that required managing. The phone number claim is a small detail in the context of the whole story, but it carries a specific weight. It describes not just estrangement, but an estrangement so complete that the basic and most private mechanism of sibling communication, a number you can call, has been removed. Denying that it's true is understandable. That the denial required a public response at all says something about the sensitivity around what the claim describes. Harry and William haven't been seen in the same place publicly since the events surrounding Queen Elizabeth's funeral in September 2022. That's approaching 3 years without a shared public appearance from two. Brothers who once appeared together at some of the most significant and most watched moments of modern royal life. The funerals, the walkabouts, the formal public occasions where their presence together communicated something about both the institution and the family. The watching world found those shared moments moving precisely because the brotherly dynamic was visible and apparently real. 3 years later, that visibility has entirely disappeared. Critics argue the accumulating pattern of Harry's absence from family occasions, from the wedding, from any confirmed meeting with Charles, from William's contact in any verified form, describes a situation where the reconciliation optimism that periodically surfaces in royal coverage, usually sourced to unnamed palace adjacent observers, has not produced any observable change in the underlying reality that the facts keep describing. Harry reportedly believed that speaking publicly about his experiences through the memoir, the interviews, the Netflix documentary would create a moment of reflection that opened a pathway. The public record of what followed suggests the outcome diverged significantly from that expectation. William and Catherine continued with their public duties without addressing the specific claims directly. The palace largely maintained its position of not commenting publicly on the allegations, a strategy that critics described as deliberate silence, and that supporters described as dignified restraint. Catherine's cancer diagnosis and recovery, announced publicly in March 2024, generated the kind of public sympathy and sustained personal support that significantly strengthened her and William's standing. The contrast with the Sussex public output of the same period was stark. Catherine's disclosure was measured and personal, driven by family necessity rather than commercial calculation, and was received accordingly. The period when the Sussex commercial operation was producing its heaviest output of content, the documentary, the memoir, the subsequent interviews, coincided with and arguably intensified the period when public sympathy for William and Catherine was at its highest. As Catherine's cancer disclosure generated the kind of personal warmth and public support that no amount of institutional PR produces. Critics argue the institution absorbed the pressure and emerged from it stronger rather than weaker. That's not the outcome Harry appeared to expect. And it has left him in a position where the levers he used to try to force a response, public disclosure, media pressure, commercial scale, appear to have produced diminishing rather than increasing leverage over time. The phone doesn't ring. The wedding invitation didn't arrive. The meeting with his father has no confirmed date. The week that produced the time recognition, the Instagram post, the Peter Phillips wedding detail, and the Scott Snow lawsuit existed entirely in that context. Not a week of dramatic ruptures, but a week of accumulated signals, each one adding to a picture that the back channel optimism articles keep trying to reframe as potential progress. The observable facts, week after week and month after month, keep producing a different picture from the one the briefings describe, and the gap between the two has not narrowed. Here's the full week in sequence, because laying it out in order is the most useful thing to do with it. Time magazine recognises Harry as one of the most influential people in sport. The online reaction questions the basis of the recognition with near universal skepticism, including a comment gathering close to 1,000 likes that asks simply whether he paid for it. The Time interview does not mention Meghan. Within hours, Meghan posts to Instagram featuring a photograph reported to be from approximately 2017. Harry was not invited to his first cousin's wedding, while William and Catherine, King Charles and Queen Camilla, and Beatrice and Eugenie all attended. Scott Snow, a Canadian Navy veteran injured at the 2023 Invictus Games, is seeking $2.4 million in damages after reportedly discovering he had no insurance coverage and is currently spending approximately $5,000 a month of his own money on residential care. The licensing fee from $30 million in Canadian public money paid to the Invictus Games Foundation is redacted from the budget documents. No meeting with King Charles is confirmed or scheduled. That's 7 separate data points from 1 week. No single one of them constitutes the complete story, but they each describe one dimension of the same underlying situation. The gap between the narrative being actively managed and the reality that the observable facts keep producing. The narrative says reconciliation is possible, that back channels are active, that Harry hopes for a meeting, that the time recognition shows his public standing, that Meghan's Instagram shows a happy family life. The observable facts say no wedding invitation, no scheduled meeting, a veteran suing the organisation Harry founded, public money with a redacted accountability gap, and an Instagram post timed to the hour of Harry's positive solo coverage that selected an 8-year-old photograph to present. Both of those things, the narrative and the observable facts, exist simultaneously. They describe different versions of the same week. The question is which version you trust more and on what basis. Critics who have been following this story carefully for years argue that the observable facts consistently provide more accurate and more reliable information than the managed narrative, and that when the two conflict, the observable facts have consistently proved more accurate. That's their position. It's worth considering, honestly, rather than dismissing, because the gap between the managed narrative and the observable outcomes has now been accumulating long enough that the track record is available for evaluation. And the track record is not flattering to the narrative. Harry arrived in California in 2020, expecting by most accounts derived from his own public statements and from the accounts of people who knew him at that time, to build a commercial and philanthropic operation that would be independent of the institution he had left, that would succeed on its own terms, in its own market, generating its own revenue, and standing, but that would also eventually, and on his own timeline, lead to some form of reconciliation with the family and institution he had departed. More than 4 years on, the major commercial partnerships have contracted or ended. The charitable organisations connected to him are under significant scrutiny from multiple directions. The family relationships are at their lowest observable point. And the week that produced the time recognition also produced a wedding exclusion, an Instagram post timed to his solo coverage, and a veterans lawsuit attached to his flagship project. The pattern across all of this isn't random. It's consistent. When Harry gets a headline that might suggest forward momentum, something else arrives in the same cycle that complicates or contradicts it. Sometimes that something is external, a lawsuit filing or a wedding guest list that makes its way into the press. Sometimes it's internal, a social media post whose timing invites exactly the interpretation it then receives. The cumulative effect is a public narrative that keeps undermining itself, not because any single element is definitive, but because the elements keep pointing in the same direction. The time recognition should have been a clean win. A major American publication acknowledging Harry's decade of work on Invictus, positioning him alongside athletes and sports figures whose influence is widely recognised. Instead, the recognition immediately became a debate about whether he deserved it, and that debate was still active when the Instagram post went up and the wedding story broke, and the Scott Snow lawsuit made headlines. The recognition didn't function as a standalone achievement because the context around it wouldn't let it. That's not a media problem. That's a positioning problem. When your public standing is contested enough that even your wins get processed as controversies, the wins stop functioning as wins. Harry's situation right now is defined by this dynamic. Every piece of positive coverage gets filtered through the accumulated skepticism that years of contested narratives have produced. Every honour gets examined for the pattern behind it. Every absence from a family occasion gets read as evidence of distance rather than scheduling difficulty. The institution he left has absorbed the public pressure he applied and emerged with its standing intact, possibly strengthened. The family relationships he hoped to reset through public disclosure have moved further away rather than closer. The commercial operation he built to sustain independence has contracted rather than expanded, And the flagship project that was supposed to be his lasting contribution, his legacy piece, Invictus, is now facing a lawsuit from a veteran who says the organization failed him when he needed it most. That's where Harry is as this week closes. Not at a family wedding with his cousins, not at a meeting with his father, not celebrating a recognition without controversy, but managing the accumulated weight of a situation where every step forward seems to generate a corresponding step back, and where the gap between what the briefings promise and what the facts deliver keeps getting wider rather than narrower. The question isn't whether Harry wants reconciliation. The question is whether the pathway to it still exists in any form he'd be willing to walk, and whether the people on the other end have any interest in meeting him there. Based on this week's observable facts, the answer to both questions looks like the same thing: no wedding invitation, no scheduled meeting, and no evidence that either is likely to change.